welcome everyone. I recently saw an introduction that was by Sarah Cantor A at the Restorative Design Conference, and I hope you like it too. So my name is Shezwe Slabbert. Captions will probably not get that quite correct. I'm going to describe myself for anyone who's joining without video or for participants with low vision. So I am a short, nerdy, yellow-brown skinned mother with round glasses and curly brown hair. I'm sitting in a dimly lit room and I happen to be based in South Africa. I'd like to acknowledge that describing ourselves is a new practice, so let's not be harsh on each other as we try to visually describe ourselves. Let us give each other and ourselves grace as we forge forward in this direction and as we try to make our events as accessible as possible. If you look at the bottom of your screen, you'll see that we have also added live captioning. So if you are unable to access it, you'll see at the bottom, in the bottom menu, there's this part over here that says live transcript. If you can, click on that and you should be able to see the closed captions. So bear in mind that it is auto-generated, so the spoken word will not be 100% accurate. There will most likely be a lot of errors, especially when it comes to my pronunciation. So those of you who know me will know that I speak a lot faster than this. I'm trying to slow down to make sure that the text can be accurate. So yeah, if you are able to click on this link over here, there'll be a link sent in your chat shortly. This will help you to connect on our Miro board, which is everybody should have access to it. It's publicly available. So this, you'll see there's a comment icon in the corner over here. If you could just click it and add it to the tree, where you would add your name, your location, role, and learning goal, and any other feedback that you have on how we could make this experience better for you. If you think there's anything lacking, or if you think we could make this a lot more accessible, please feel free to leave a comment, and or you can stay on the line after the event, and because I will be online if you'd like to talk to me directly. Then if you'd like to reach out in other ways, you can also email info@designnerd.co.za. This evening, because we have quite a long evening plan, if you go to interaction-design.org, you'll be able to get more information about the Interaction Design Foundation. Usually we do go through an introduction on what the foundation is about, but I think we have had our events quite often for everybody to have context, but if you need further information, please go to this website. So this evening, we have a very special guest. We're going to be doing something a little bit different from our normal product design groups, where we have a designer from Chicago. He has created his company in collaboration with his partner and wife, Sarah, to specifically focus on the social sector as a design firm. This means that they partner with organizations and communities to design human-centered solutions, basically building capacity for social innovation. They are ultimately using human-centered design to address social problems. So if you'd like to also find out more about them, you can go to greatergoodstudio.com. So without further ado, here is George.
Community, and I'm thrilled to be here. It's also kind of magical. It's still kind of, I think, pretty amazing that we're able to do all this remote conferencing as it stands. Let me see if I can now do a screen share. And I do apologize if my screen share becomes a little wonky. There's a chance it could. If that happens, I'm going to ask you to take over, and then I'll be nudging her to kind of go to the next slide. But let's see how far we can get with this as it stands. Can I check? Do you see green slides? Fantastic. Okay. As I talk, I'll be obviously referring to what's on screen. If you start to notice a drift and start to say, hey, look, the slide hasn't advanced anytime soon, please be sure to check me or take yourself off mute and let me know, because it can be hard for me to know when it is or isn't working. Right. Well, hi everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. This is going to be a 2-hour session, I believe, where we'll have initially a bit of a talk, where I'll be presenting a point of view, then host a little bit of a Q&A, and then if it's okay, I'd love to have some facilitated discussions on power and privilege as we go through. And in those cases, we'll be going into small breakout rooms. Does that all make sense? Great. So a little about Gradico Studio. We are based here in Chicago. We're going to be celebrating our 10th anniversary. And our exclusive focus has always been working in the social sector, which means that our clients are all nonprofits, foundations, or government agencies. And in that regard, we've been fortunate in being able to work across a lot of different project areas. And many of them, I think, remain, for us at least, issue agnostic. This is for our studio's perspective, is to say, like, we don't focus on any particular issue other than we work across many, many issues. And because of those patterns, I think we're able to leverage a lot of learnings that come across many of those different kinds of projects. And we do this work because we believe design can be restorative. This is sort of a newish, I'd say, piece of language for us to try to better understand sort of what is the role that we perhaps have within the studio, within the industry, but also kind of what is the role perhaps of what design can be and perhaps should be. But in order for it to perhaps get to a restorative state, I think we have to acknowledge the harm that it can potentially do. I guess I'm curious to know how many people here, and perhaps you could just put your answers in the chat, might identify as a designer. If you feel like you're definitely a designer, could you put a 10? And you're more like, I think I'm a designer, or I'm not even sure what the word means, maybe a 1. Please enter your. Oh, wow, there's a lot. Wow, this is a solid set of 10s here. I appreciate Chris being a 6. Wow, there's a lot of designers on this call. That's just fantastic. Well, so I appreciate that. I still feel like I'm not sure if I know how to do that. I think I could do a pretty good impression of being a designer, so I feel like I'm maybe more like a 7 or 8 at this point. But I'm glad to be amongst so many designers. So I want to kind of share this point of view because the work that we do at the studio, and perhaps others are familiar with this term, human-centered design, what I think can be sometimes lost in this, and these are our graphics, but I'm sure others have seen sort of similarly cute colored icons that represent a process for human-centered design. If you haven't, there are many out there in the world. While these are potentially ours, the process human-centered design has been around for quite a while, but I think sometimes it gets lost that there is a bit of a hidden conceit. The conceit is that if you center humans, it must always be good for them. That's what you would one might assume. And unfortunately, I don't think that that's always true. Actually, because of how much we center them, there may be things that we can do that might be harmful. So I don't know if folks are familiar with this product. This has been hugely impactful here in the United States, but the Juul e-cigarette is a small little vaping product. It's about the size of a USB thumb drive. But these quotes here from Bloomberg says Adam Bowens and James Montes were pursuing master's degrees in product design at Stanford when they decided to do something about their smoking addictions. Is anyone else familiar with this story of the Juul? It's Juul. So this product became a massive public health crisis across the United States because they started not only making this product and then becoming very highly addictive, but also were very deliberately marketing these vaping products and flavoring them with fruit flavors from watermelon to strawberry in order to grow their market share of young adults. And in doing so, creating an enormous amount of monetary value. This is a quote from Bloomberg because at the time when this product got launched and the company became for sale, I'm seeing a note from the chat. Hi, everyone. Please be very descriptive as I can't see. Ranesh, are you describing the slides? Are my slides advancing? I can't tell. Can anyone else tell me if my slides are advancing?
So if you could maybe just describe the image that's on the screen.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Yes, of course. So Ranesh, this is a small rectangular gray object, and it's about maybe 4 inches long. It's a smaller rectangular plastic object that has a couple of metal contacts at the bottom. What that is used sometimes is to recharge it. So it's almost like a little tiny rechargeable device. But what happens is that thing heats up an interior element, and then you inhale. So if you, let me just see if I can check this in. The spelling of this product is called Juul, spelled Juul. So this product became incredibly popular by a number of different people who were interested in making smoking products, even though they specifically said we're hoping to help people no longer smoke cigarettes. They saw no problem in helping people become addicted to something else altogether. And actually, these are now quotes from Stanford's own magazine, because Stanford, which is the epicenter for product design and particularly sort of design thinking, their quotes from their own alumni magazine about this product states, Monzies and Bowens approached smokers on campus and asked them what they loved and hated about their habit. The complaints were consistent: fear of being seen with a cigarette and paranoia about smelling of smoke on a first date. The first prototypes were ad hoc assemblies of bespoke components and items found on drugstore shelves. They were, and I would argue, are practicing human-centered design. The very same process that I just outlined to be the one I assume is good for humans, I think they weaponized and made a highly addictive product in addition to sort of their design work at school, but also build a business on the very idea that they can make highly addictive products. And I think they did that because they studied and understood humans so well. Had they not studied humans and perhaps even studied human-centered design at Stanford, I would argue perhaps this product might not have been as addictive as it actually ultimately became. And it is still, I think, probably until COVID, was one of the largest public health crises happening across the United States and across the globe now. Now, it's not to say that design doesn't have conventional standards. Can I get a thumbs up that the slides are advancing okay? Great. So I'm not sure if folks are familiar with these, but Dieter Rams, who's still alive, actually, is an older sort of kind of like a bit of a legend, actually, has been around for a long time and has established these 10 rules for what makes good design for a long, long time. And I've referred to them as a design professor myself. But what's interesting is if you look across all 10, even the product as simple as the jewel, as highly problematic and addictive as it is, would have still passed Dieter Rams's test. So somewhere along the line, because of how design has grown up, and I think because of the way the discipline has established, it is saying that these 10 rules somehow would miss a product as problematic as the jewel e-cigarette. So it's almost as though these 10 rules are morally agnostic, almost as though they don't take a moral stance on design at all. I think what I like to discuss is the idea that design in many cases assumes good intent by designers at all times. Now folks are saying they can't see the 10 rules. Can it? Okay, let me stop the screen share. Shisui, are you able to take over by any chance? Perfect. Are folks able to see that okay? Okay, great.
Sorry, I'm just making full screen.
Thank you. Oh, Jenna, thanks so much for sending out that link as well. So yeah, this idea of these 10 rules for product design have been around a really long time, and they're more classical, I'd say, in industrial design than perhaps in other fields, but they're very translatable across many different kinds of design disciplines. But as I said, if you look across these 10, they don't seem to take any sort of moral position altogether. I think it just assumes that designers are morally whole and wouldn't possibly make any harm. And I think that that's kind of what I think I have a bit of an issue with. I think design can't actually, perhaps shouldn't be the ones to determine if they're making harm or not, because I'm not sure if necessarily we have a lot of practice in determining that in the first place. If you go to the next slide. These 10 rules can be reduced down to possibly just two: form and its function. How beautiful does it look and how well does it work? And again, I think when you reduce design's sort of like guiding principles, it kind of misses perhaps the ethical and moral questions about what should and why should we be designing things in the first place. And as design continues to enter more and more complex spaces, if you look at the next slide, for instance, something as complicated as criminal justice reform, should our evaluation for what is good simply rely on what it looks like and how well does it work? Is that enough? Is the reduction of those 10 rules down to these two going to suffice when perhaps a lot of the complexity that makes social sector problems what's so pernicious get truly reflected in these problem statements and in this evaluation. If you go to the next slide. What counts as good, I tend to find, is not quite good enough. And I think how we describe what and define what good is tends to be a little problematic. If you go to the next slide. I ended up thinking a lot more about this topic area around kind of how do we judge and evaluate good because of how design has its roots in business, and it's sort of like now finding itself in more and more complex social sector issues. I started to worry that perhaps design isn't really ready for the complexity of the social sector. So if you look on the next slide, what we celebrate tends to shape our culture. What we elevate to be good tends to set the tone for many other conversations for what people want to follow and model along. And I feel like it's worth questioning kind of what is good in the social sector, what is good in design, when its basis for who we serve and why we do the work has fundamentally changed. If you go to the next slide. And I would argue it's actually my conventional training that has given me this very conventional view of what good was. That in my case, I grew up in England and studied design in the United Kingdom. And it's just almost like very 90s view of the world and of what good was that I still carry in me, that I find is a bit of a liability when I show up in these complex social spaces. Next slide, please. So I want to suggest that perhaps there are other ways in which you can evaluate design, perhaps even principles that we've seen across the studio that I want to share with us. And we'll be kind of navigating what these are in our discussions later on after this talk. Next slide, please. I'd argue that good design has perhaps these three principles that we've seen again and again in our office. Next slide. Good design honors reality. We'd say that good design creates ownership, and that good design builds power. These are terms that I don't remember hearing much about studying design in England in the 90s. And I don't remember really ever hearing it in my career coming up through places like RDO and others here in the United States. It just didn't seem to be sort of terminology. And I think it's because design tends to look within itself for its own inspiration, as opposed to looking beyond. And I'd suggest that it's these terms of honoring reality, creating ownership, building power, whether we draw inspiration from by learning from other disciplines adjacent to ours. If you look at the next slide, fields like anthropology, social work, and organizing, I think might be areas for design and designers to learn the most from, as they share a similar interest in humans and their behavior when they study the world. So I'd say that that's maybe these are sort of like these adjacent areas that I think might have the most return versus a lot of I don't know if anyone knows the constant navel gazing and complaining that designers love to make about how we're not getting invited at the table. Like we're at every bloody table now. Can we please stop complaining about it? I've had enough. All right, next slide. So my training says good design honors the future. Has anyone ever here worked on a future of project in their career? Future of projects are like the bread and butter of design work. I did them to death, okay? But what I find so convenient about it is that when we think about the future, we conveniently skip over the now. So if we look at the next slide. When we did our work here in Minneapolis, across multiple projects, but one in particular, we think that often the good design needs to honor reality as it is before we skip over to this future state where everyone's in flying cars and has wireless charging everywhere. Like if you look at the next slide, excuse me, work we did in Minneapolis, Minnesota, when we're looking at new models of care for complex patients in healthcare, our individuals who we did it for learn from research don't have the opportunity to just like fast forward. They have to live the daily reality as it stands. And one of the challenges we know when we looked at healthcare, in particular in this particular project, if you go next slide, is a challenge around the stability of someone's housing. And that rather what maybe perhaps a surprise to me, but maybe not to everyone on this call, was how intimately linked your relationship to healthcare is tied to the stability of your housing. So to be able to say, look, what is the future state of what is the future of telemedicine requires so many foundational pieces to be stable that to state that that isn't true for everyone kind of undoes or sort of unties so much of what we might assume is baked into a project when we think about the future state of something when we do our design work. But I would argue that because of how our research participants and the people we serve, they don't have the affordance of just fast forwarding. We need to meet them where they are, and what that means to kind of honor the reality as it stands today. Next slide. What we tend to notice is that learned experiences, the place where we spend a lot of our expertise and where we value expertise, tends to be the places and things that have generated through what we have either experienced professionally or in schools. It's the kind of thing that we would write down on our LinkedIn profile. Does anybody here have a LinkedIn profile on this call? What I tend to find is that the things we have on our LinkedIn profile will constitute our learned experiences. We tend not to put much value in lived experiences, which is a shame. So many of us have them, but we tend not to, we kind of demote them as being credible sources for expertise. So what I would suggest is that in addition to the learned experience, which makes a lot of people here on this call, I'm sure have great professional standing, and is kind of the major currency for expertise, we might want to elevate lived experience in addition, not to mean that learned experience has to go down, but simply bring lived experience up so that it might be somewhere on par with the major currency for how we think about expertise in the world today. So many of our research participants only have lived experience as the place as a source of expertise. And I think that goes often discounted when we think about how the world works. Next slide. My training says good design retains ownership. Man, designers get so bent out of shape if they don't get the credit for the right product, especially when it comes to award time or sort of like getting credit during a recognition. It's the kind of thing that designers have almost like trained and baked into our discipline. We want to make sure we own everything and have kind of, have a lot of credit in the right places. What I tend to find though, is if you look at the next slide, is that when we do social change work, there has to be a designed element from the very beginning, from the very outset of the project, that good design creates ownership in those who are affected by this change, which means we have to deliberately dial down our egos and dial down the role that is traditionally afforded a studio like ours. If you could look at the next slide. When we looked at this project with the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, we knew that in order for us to do this change work, we needed to do in 6 different communities around the country that spanned urban, suburban, rural, and tribal communities. We knew that a team in Chicago traveling to each city was never going to lead to the kind of transformative change that we knew each community could do on their own if we created a dependency on us as a team. Anyone familiar with the idea of like a parasitic relationship? The idea that perhaps somebody, when they start a relationship, causes new dependencies. If you go to the next slide. I feel like design consulting in many ways is built on the very model of dependency. That if you don't create dependency, you don't get paid. So knowing that there's a risk that we might create a dependency in this project, we knew we had to kind of make an intervention in of ourselves before someone else calls it out. So what that meant for us was we had to build capacity for a local community team to be the trainers of local community members so that sort of convening organization didn't need our help beyond the one time. That way, their knowledge stays exactly in place, and new learnings every time they do another cycle stays resident in that area. Next slide. What we tend to find as an observation is that people adopt the change that they're a part of making. I feel like I want to get this on a t-shirt. This is something we see so often again and again and again, that if you've ever sort of like woken up to an email that just like changed your life, can you see how dramatically different if that would have felt if you had been part of writing that email in the first place? I feel like it's so consistently true that when change happens to people, not only does it cause a lot of like shock and perhaps like re-traumatization, but also a sense of like, I'm just completely powerless to make this change. Whereas adoption for new behavior, adoption for new change could be radically rethought if the very people impacted were simply part of that design process in the first place. Next slide. Now, this one is probably the hardest. My training says good design hoards power. And I don't really think it's fair for me to say that this is something exclusive to designers. I think everybody tends to think of power in this very kind of limited way of hoarding it, like it's this zero-sum game. What we tend to find is that when we think about design in the social sector, particularly when it comes to complex social issues, power shows up in all of it. So how might we think about this differently? So if you look at the next slide, we try to, although it's very, very difficult, probably the hardest thing we tackle every time we start projects, is how does good design build power in places that have so little of it? If they had it, they probably wouldn't even need our help in the first place. And if we knew how to do this, we would have changed the world. So I'm not remotely suggesting this is easy. I think this is the hardest challenge we have as a studio. How are we deliberately trying to build power and not further concentrate the power that was already there before we started? And there's even a sneaky thing that can happen in a lot of design firms. How do we end up concentrating power from a funder or from a community back to us as a design team? I've seen that sneaky move by designers happen a lot. Look at the next slide, please. Now let's take a second, almost like a bit of a detour, and just think about power for a minute. One of the best definitions I've heard, it was just from my co-founder actually, was that power is the ability to change another person's reality. And I think in that example where it's mentioned about how an email might come to you one morning and just like your world is now totally different. That happens to people all the time. It's probably happened to some of you on this call. So when someone's reality can change overnight and you have the ability to do that, that might be a measure of how much power you have. If you look at the next slide, the second observation with power is to recognize that power is often lopsided, as in there is a lot of asymmetry baked into a lot of relationships where power shows up. Now, I want to kind of like change the scale a little, because when I think about when I've often heard about power in the past, it was often describing almost like global leaders talking about the world stage, like politicians. And actually, while it's true, I think it's also helpful to think about power on a much smaller scale, like a one-to-one scale, like relationships between yourself and your parents, for instance, or you and your siblings, or you and your team. That sort of scale tends to sort of get a little underreported when you think about how power shows up. Although I do know people have ever sometimes said, man, there was a lot of weird power dynamics in that meeting. Has anyone ever heard that phrase? In those cases, I've often go, but what does that mean? Like, I understand you had a shitty meeting, but like, what actually, like, what happened? So to visualize power asymmetry, if you look at the next slide, I want to just show that it's often like this. There's a sharp end and a wide end. And if any of you here on this call has ever, let's say, started a project, and at the very start you can tell, oh my God, I'm never getting out of this alive. The timing doesn't make sense. The budget's all off. I don't even know who this team is. I'm screwed. If that's ever happened to you, and that was like me most of my career at IDEO, that's you on the sharp end of a power asymmetry. You're at the pointy end, subject to a lot of pressure, and somebody somewhere else is applying that pressure on the wide end. Now, if you go to the next slide, you'll see some classical power asymmetric relationships. These have been around forever and have and continue to be the case. Law enforcement with detainees, doctors and patients, employees and employees, funders and grantees, it continues. There could almost be a full talk just on this one topic area. Now, Greater Studio, which is our firm, we were like, yeah, let's fight the man. We were supposed to be like all about those on the right-hand side on the pointy end, right? Except in order for us to do projects, we have to be quite aligned with those in power. So if you look at the next slide, you'll see it was embarrassing for us to finally admit that actually, in order for Greater Studio to even do a project, we have to get quite chummy with the most powerful people that are often on the other side of a symmetry with those we're trying to help. Can you see how that makes for a fairly awkward scenario? It can be so asymmetric in times that actually we just haven't done projects because we don't believe that anything is ever going to change because of how the project has been set up from the very start. In fact, us showing up might make things worse, which is why we have to be very cautious. And we've now done, I think my last track was at 50 breakup emails over the last 10 years, trying to work out, I don't think we can do this because I think the power is so askew. I don't think it's going to be better after we've done this project. Next slide, please. So if we look at a project, where we think power may have been shifted. We looked at a project with renters and landlords and the relationship, which is very symmetric from the start. And what we noticed, if we look at the next slide, was that there are relationships where great landlords and great tenants have great relationships based on a level of communication and respect, and also almost like a long-term view of themselves. But in the situations where it's very fraught and quite broken, we found that a lot of tenants have a very difficult time trying to get their messages heard, like to get things fixed within their home. So what we ended up doing was designing a piece of software for MTO called Squared Away that really just works in Chicago, but it leverages some latent power that the MTO did by changing policy in Chicago and in Illinois, which is to remind tenants if a landlord doesn't fix the issue, they're in violation of their lease, and that the tenant has the right to use their own rent money to go fix it. It's called self-remedy, and it's a pretty powerful thing that tenants have that are often most tenants are not even aware that they have that kind of power at their fingertips. So this software kind of helps makes that surface a little easier for them. Next slide. As an observation, we found that people with the least power are often closest to the problem. And what that can mean is that a lot of insight and learning about what is really happening at that sort of like proximity to the problem is a place that designers so rarely get close to. And so often our funders and the people who are hiring are nowhere near. So I want to default a lot more respect and sort of affordance of deference to those who are that close, because their familiarity with the problem actually makes them experts. And it's our job in many cases as a studio is to get closer to it, because often we don't have, not always, but we often don't have that kind of proximity to the problem that our research participants do. Next slide, please. So here are some takeaway questions that I think perhaps can reverberate throughout the whole workshop, but also beyond. We value learned experiences, but discount lived experiences. Next slide. How might your process honor reality? Second question. Next slide, please. People adopt the change that they're a part of making. Next slide. How might your process create ownership? And lastly, the people with the least power are often closest to the problem. Next slide. How might your process build power? So we're going to take a break here. Next slide. Can I just check? Yes. Okay, good. Shisui, do you mind taking off the screen share for a bit? We can pause a second. And I think there's some time for us to maybe just reflect, take some questions, and maybe just let some of it sit before we plan on doing some facilitated discussions in small groups. Shisui, how are we doing on time?
We're still good for time.
Great.
We're still on track, yeah.
So I'd love to maybe see if folks will do put the questions in the chat, or reactions or responses, and or take themselves off mute, and we can talk a little about what I shared before going into our breakout rooms.
Is everybody shy?
I see a question. What lived experience did you have to promote discovery of the 3 principles mentioned? And then maybe can we see the 2 questions again? Shisha, do you mind actually trying to see if you can, since you have the slides, could you type those questions back into the chat?
Yeah, I'm busy doing that now.
Thank you so much. While I think about Angelina's question. That's such a great question, Angelina. I've not thought of that before. I guess what we realized is that when we were looking across our projects, just so you know, understand like how we ended up doing it. We ended up trying to see if we could almost map every project we've ever done to see, is there anything here? I was struck by a question I got asked by somebody in the community in Chicago, and they simply asked, so what patterns are you seeing since you do all this work? I'm like, oh shit, I don't know. Pattern? I don't know. We were just so busy just trying to do the work. I never thought to stop for patterns. I thought that's a good question. We should probably think about that. So we like laid it all out, and I think we've done about 150 projects at this point, and we try to work out how many of these 150 projects are the same or different. Like what makes them similar? So we almost like take out redundancies to try to see, is there anything happening here? And we got those down to maybe like 50 unique projects that were different than each other. Then we thought, is there anything here as a pattern? And this process of trying to determine a theme or pattern or behavior based on data that we had is kind of how we do our work typically when we do research and synthesis. So the idea of trying to write down what are these patterns initially started probably about a dozen different themes that then narrowed down to these final three principles. And there was about as much work just trying to write the words on a reality, create ownership, build power, as much as there were in all of the time spent just doing all of the sorting and collecting of information. Because I think what we try to do a lot at the studio is try to be both precise and accurate in how we describe our language. It's very difficult to write well. I'm not a very strong writer. I know my counterparts are at the studio, but I find that that's a ton of work trying to get the language clear. Angeline, I can't tell if I answered your question properly, but let me know if I did. I appreciate these questions. Are there other comments? I see Claire with a hand up. Hi, Claire.
Hi. Apologies, I can't turn my camera on because I
Okay.
don't have any power at the moment. But I did have a question. So I worked on a project a couple of years ago for the Gates Foundation, which was about a medical health record. And I mean, we pushed very hard, and we're eventually able to get them on board with doing research with people living with a disease that we were building this product for. And it took a lot to get them to the place where they would even agree to do the research. Afterwards, when we gave through the recommendations, it felt very much like they didn't necessarily care about them. You know, some of the right out the gate, some of the conversations were around like this fancy app that they wanted to build, which their target market, you know, doesn't use apps and don't have data. You know, there's data issues in South Africa and all of that. And we fed all of that through. So, I mean, in terms of being able to get close to the people who are experiencing this problem that this medical health record was supposed to solve, we tried as much as we could. But then in terms of that creating ownership, your second point, I'd be quite interested to hear what you say, like how in that kind of instance, when you've actually got to get somebody else on board with the people who are living the experience, having ownership, how do you get to that point?
Yeah, I'm going to have a really not very satisfying answer for you. We worked with the Gates Foundation. I got to speak at the Seattle office in front of, I think, about maybe 50 different program officers, but they're all US focused. So I know that there's the foundation has a big split between the international development side and then the US sort of program side. But within US programs, at least, I got to present and actually spoke specifically about these principles and then said to them in the room, just being in this room kind of freaks me out. Because what this means is that if we do a project with you and we screw something up, we've screwed up at a scale we've never screwed up before. And that just gives me a lot of chills. Okay. So we were deliberately trying to tell them, like, I don't want to do bad projects with you. So then I think that kind of caused them to be very excited about us. And I think that just wanted them to work with us more. But then we spent about a year working with a particular program officer, trying to get them to kind of like push the project earlier and earlier and earlier to be reframed such that this key question is, when we discover things that will challenge your strategy, how are you going to respond? To what degree, which is maybe kind of like almost like a different talk, how do you see us simply validating a thesis you have? Claire, does that make sense? And how will you tackle, how will you and your organization handle being challenged by information we know we can gather from those who are impacted by this project? And that can be hard for them to have that conversation, which is why I spent a year saying, no, that's not the right project. No, we can't do that project. No, we can't do that project. And we kept delaying and delaying and delaying until we felt like, okay, this project is just open enough. And I think we may have built enough trust with this program officer to be able to handle the news of stuff we find that would directly challenge the ongoing thesis. And I'm so sorry that I think what you discovered was just so classically problematic at the Gates Foundation, which is that there's a lot of techno-solutionism. I heard this phrase actually from a program officer, which is said they have this thing called a silicon bullet. Has anyone ever heard this before? It kind of like shocked me because just how accurate it was. The idea of like through technology, we can solve everything. So there's a lot of that at the Gates Foundation. And I'm sorry that that's what you experienced. But I would say in those situations, if it's possible, how do we delay or simply say, I refuse to do projects where I am simply executing on your plan? Because then what is the point of us doing the research in the first place? Claire, again, I can't tell if that's satisfying or if that's just more maddening, but that's what we've experienced when we worked with them. Is it Giovanni? I see a hand up.
Yes, it is. So thank you very much. I'm not a dedicated designer, more on the product side, but I think everyone that's involved in product delivery in some shape or form more and more understands the value of of the design aspects per se, and we collaborate and perform portions of it. So I have to confess, the first 5 minutes of the talk was difficult for me to listen to, because what I mean is the liberal in me, the libertarian in me, said, you know what, you were critiquing the vape solution. I think there is so all of this is necessary. Marty Kagan, who's always preached the 4 key risks of value and usability and technical feasibility and business viability, but he's been also proposing and pushing for this 5th risk of ethical, because we have a responsibility as product people and as designers to do the right thing. Not can we do it, but like, should we do it, sort of thing. I would so the question to you is, would you agree, or could you comment on the statement that we must also be careful, though, to be patronizing and instill our particular views, especially in this era of wokeness and all of this that we're seeing, to say, you know what, no, I'm going to criticize somebody. It's bad for a designer to have designed an amazing vape product, because I don't believe that people should vape, and I believe that they are primarily responsible for making sure that people don't vape, or that only certain people are vape if they're above age, etc., etc. And it's like, is there an aspect to this where while we have this, I think, historical void of ethicalness, and we need to inject it, but that there's also with that this risk of projecting your values, your view in that, and maybe how it speaks to some of the other points you made around involving people, etc.
Yeah, I would say, Giovanni, that the position is inherently political and absolutely carries our bias. But I think that's why I think design as a discipline has been so poor, because we get so rarely asked for our judgment, and we so rarely get practice judgment. We simply execute plans. Like, we are often the hands for dirty money. We're often the hands for things that are inherently corrupt in the first place. And the questions we typically ask is, when can we do it, and for how much money, and on which kind of what's time schedule? We very rarely pause to say, should we do this? And I appreciate the idea that perhaps there is autonomy and self-efficacy still in play, so that perhaps people who are opting into vaping versus not is still a choice. But there are already a number of public health guidelines that would say that some things are inherently corruptible and corrupting, in the same way that other mandated addictive substances have had other systems in place to be protective. So I think it is hard for me to simply push autonomy and self-choice and self-efficacy onto users, when at the same time there is so few safety nets to be protective. And when I see the hop, skip, and a jump that I know a lot of designers to make to say, well, if I don't do it, someone else is going to do it anyway. If I do it, at least I know I'll do a good job of it. That kind of rhetoric that I know a lot of designers can do, and I know I've done it when I worked at commercial design studios like IDEO, abdicate any sense of responsibility that I think we could be making to say, I don't think we should do this project. But usually by the time a designer gets to it, it's already too late anyway. So I think there is a spectrum of responses, but there are definitely, I think, massive gaps in where designers could be playing a larger role in judgment and in basically to say, should we do this at all? That I think we often kind of like sweep aside because we're so busy trying to get paid.
Yeah, thank you very much. It was kind of I was playing devil's advocate, and I'm so happy that you've doubled down and responded to that, because I mean, like, I'm a non-smoker. I don't like I wouldn't want to work on a vape product, for example. And it's your earlier point about, I think you didn't use the words, but it's kind of like speaking truth to power, where you kind of need to be friends on the power side, but you need to influence so that you can potentially protect or empower downstream. And I think part of that speaking truth to power is also speaking your truth, is being true to yourself, because then if collectively we are true to ourselves, it can only be much, much, much better overall than what it has been historically.
Yeah, and I think that's why we have so little practice even identifying what matters to us, that when we get given an agenda by a client, we end up assuming that one instead. And that's really scary, because what it means is that designers can be easily bought for what agenda they're going to work on. I've seen the companies I've worked for in the past get bought for stupid shit all the time. And it's not that expensive. It's cheap. Like $1 million will get you a ton of design effort. But considering sort of how much at risk we might end up amplifying harm, because design is sort of like such a massive accelerator for many different sort of technologies and for different kinds of thinking, I think there needs to be some sort of like cautionary, either set of cautionary advisors or something just to pump the brakes a little. I joke about this a lot, but I feel sometimes I'm like the bloody designated driver, like the person not drinking, and design is often just at the bar doing shots. Like all they want to do is party all the time. It's like, can we take a second and just see, is there a risk in doing this project? And if there was even like a checklist or something that would allow us to like slow down and say, ask the question, not intended consequences, but also unintended consequences, maybe not every project would go perhaps as with such rocket fuel as I've often seen. Now I'm just ranting. Thanks, Giovanni, for the question. I see a hand up. Is it Riven?
Hello? Yeah, it's Ravon.
Ravon, good to meet you.
Thank you. Good to meet you too. Thanks so much for the talk. Yeah, I just want to mention I commented in our in the comment in the chat. Just like sometimes in South Africa we don't really have the luxury, to refuse projects because we sometimes just need that bread and butter. But at the same time, I think one can still, even if you're taking on a project where they're setting out the stuff for you and they're saying you're gonna build this and it should happen like that. I think it's if we take on that project, it still gives us the opportunity to communicate with those different stakeholders and maybe the people in power that's not the right people that are in power. And then slowly we can kind of chip away and communicate with those people that are paying us to maybe do something shit. But at the same time, we can then educate is the wrong word, but like just maybe share and communicate and guide. And then it maybe comes back to what you said, like that conversation that you had, like asking them, what will you guys do with the info that we discover? Are we going to change course with the entire project? And sometimes with like big corporates, it's hard to like move that ship into the right direction. But I do still think that there is maybe value in getting the bread and butter on the table and actually engaging with them and slowly chipping away and showing them a nicer way, a different way. That might be,
yeah. I think that there's a wide spectrum of sort of how social change can happen and kind of what the intent is. I do think a frank conversation with one's sponsors and with one's sort of funders and to check like to what degree is this social change, or to what degree is this nibbling at the edges? And I feel like being a little more candid about what are those expectations will probably go a long way, because I do think that a lot of social trust amongst community can be wasted when we promote it to be like, this is going to be really transformative, when actually it's very incremental. And that disconnect, I think a lot of people can feel, but we often kind of ignore. So I'm wondering, could we at least be clear, if this is going to be incremental, please don't promote this as being social change. Let's just call it what it is. But if we do want to do something that has a large impact, perhaps longer term, and perhaps maybe speaks to the change we will often tell people on commercials and advertisements, then we have to think about the process to do that to be radically different. So I think kind of that the matching of expectations requires conversations at the sponsor side, and then certainly with community. Thank you for that comment, Rivan. I think we might be starting to get ready to maybe transition, but are there any other final comments before we do so? I've been trying to keep up with the chat, but there's so many things happening. It's a little hard to keep track of at the same time. This has been great. I've really enjoyed the comments so far. So what I was thinking is to maybe think about breakout rooms. Are folks still available to do breakout rooms? Can I get some thumbs ups if that's true? Okay. Shisru, if you could set up multiple breakout rooms with about 3 people per room, that would help a lot. And then also, if we could go back to the slides.
Okay, I'm just quickly doing my maths to try and figure out 23 divided by 3.
You're doing great. Thank you so much. Actually, let me see if I can set up the slide, because we probably won't need as many transitions. Let's see if I can. Let me do that slide part, and you do the breakout rooms. Okay. Depending on how much time we have, we'll do a few of these breakout rooms. Let's see.
So do you want me to share the file in the chat?
No, I'm going to, let me just do the screen share for now, Shizue. I think that might be it.
Okay.
And then folks can be in their breakout rooms in just a second. Okay, can I check? Do you see a green slide?
Yep.
Yep, okay. So this is before we start, just want to say a big thank you to a person I learned a lot of these techniques from called Akai Winwood. They are based in the Bay Area and have done fantastic work at an institution called the Rockwood Institute, where I learned a lot of these techniques. Okay, let's see. We're going to talk about power and identity. Is that transitioning for you? Do you see that slide?
Yep.
Great. Let's see again. All right, so here are the 3 questions, okay? Annoyingly, these are kind of like the same question 3 different times, but they're slightly different, okay? First question is, what identity do you claim? What identity was placed on you? And then what identity did you earn? It's the same question 3 times. I know, it's annoying. And I also know that it's kind of frustrating that it's so similar, but they do require slightly different responses. So just to maybe give an example of kind of how I might respond to this, although I don't want to color your responses too much, is when I think about the kind of identity that I claim, that actually is of a professor. I've been teaching for over 10 years. I never got my master's though. And I still kind of keep thinking like someone's going to find out that somehow I don't have the right credentials, but I do claim to be this type of person, even though I think I'm fairly good at it. But I'm always concerned that that's kind of like someone will somehow like find out that there's a gap here. Identity that was placed on me, that of a Asian, male, cis, able-bodied gentleman with a British accent. I did nothing for these things, yet here I am, and they were all sort of given to me at birth. And then my identity that I earned, I think of a designer, or even let's just say like a business owner. I work pretty hard at these things, and I feel like there's been some effort attached to that identity. But I really would love to make sure that everybody feels comfortable addressing these any which way they'd like. There's certainly no wrong answer to these. I just like for you to sit with them. So maybe before you go into your breakout rooms, and she's ready. Do you see ready soon?
Yeah.
Okay, before you go into your breakout rooms, I'm going to give everybody, let's say, 3 minutes just to compile and think about their answers. Maybe you want to write it down or type it somewhere so that you could have a rich discussion in your small breakout rooms of about 3 people each. And I'd love for all of you to maybe think about and respond to these questions in real time and maybe share what you wrote or listen to others as they speak. And then you'll be in their breakout room for about, let's say, 5 minutes. Is everybody clear on the instructions?
Yeah, thanks.
So do you mind adding those questions, identity you claim? Could you put that in the chat so everybody has them?
Okay, I'll do that.
Thank you.
Okay, so shall I break us out?
Yeah, I think that sounds good.
Okay, 5 minutes. Bye.
Okay. You should see invites for your breakout rooms.
Okay, looks like we're all left with each other here. Hi.
Hi.
How are you, Gina?
Yes, I dropped
Our identity based on the standards of the world, like, you know, being smart or learning more, or becoming a doctor or you know, getting that PhD. Is that something that you should be proud of? Or, you know, if we look at our former presidents, you know, Mandela and them, did they earn that title, you know, or was it just placed on them just to calm the tension of our country? So yeah, as we were getting deeper, we thought about, you know, the ceilings that we've reached in design in corporate South Africa. There is a definite ceiling for people that look like us, where we don't get to go past a certain role, even though we are qualified and we have more experience.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And I think it's very true that pattern of working 1x, 2x, 3x, or 4x, or 10x has been a pattern that I've seen for folks where almost no matter how much you try, that ceiling is present. And I've certainly worked amongst folks who seemingly are on like a moving sidewalk. I don't know if you folks are familiar with this, but you know, if you ever go to an airport, sometimes they have those things where you're like standing and everything's just moving gracefully. I feel like I'm running and I can see people who are not working all that hard at all cruising past me. And I've often wondered what the hell is going on. And I think a lot of that time was spent wondering, what have I done wrong? As opposed to perhaps thinking sort of, how has the system been set up? And I think that that's some of the thing that we talk about in these challenging questions around identity is we are often placed in situations that are not of our choosing, and that despite the effort, there could still be a lot of work that seems to be needlessly done in order just to kind of even just stand still. Can I hear from anyone else before we think about maybe moving to the next section? Jen?
I think for us, the questions just raised a lot of questions.
Sorry about that.
Which I guess was the point, but we ended up talking a lot about what do these things say about you as a person, and how, when you claim something, what does that tell other people around you, and what does it tell the people you're telling the story to? If they know maybe what you earned, does the imposter syndrome, and is that gap from imposter syndrome we didn't get a lot onto the politics, but also, we talk about diversity in design and having a lot of different views and lenses in design. Now, imagine if all of us have 3 lenses each, and now there's a diverse audience with 3 different aspects to them. What does that do to how we understand each other and how we work with each other? So we had a lot of questions and not very many answers.
It sounds like you had a fantastic conversation. I don't think I can give you the answers either, but I think also that those questions that you're asking of yourselves, we so rarely give ourselves the time to ask them, because this is what we talked about in our group. Someone's answering it before you even had a chance to say a single word out loud or any actions that you do. It's getting answered within like a fleeting microsecond. You're getting categorized and sorted and put in boxes. And it could be that clues come across in how you speak, perhaps which car, if you have a car, pull up in. There are all these sort of like precursors that, again, people are using as sorting and categorizing tools. It just kind of seems so sad that that's how we've reduced so much of our human experiences. I know that in our group, there's a default there, certainly in the United States, where as soon as we find out someone's name, we ask, what did they do? As though there's no possible value that someone can have unless there's a tie to a job or productivity. So I know that that's a thing that I know I still do, and I can't help myself half the time when I meet someone. But I know that that sort of like categorization is an oversimplification for what is actually quite complex. So Jen, I think you guys did great. Thanks for engaging with those questions. If there isn't any other maybe final comments before we move on. Okay, I'm going to try screen sharing one more time, and we have until I think maybe 40 more minutes total. So we're going to try to see if we can maybe do at least one more section. Let's see if I can share my screen. Is everybody seeing something that says privilege and context? Yes. Okay, great. So privilege, I think, is a really complicated and very confusing term these days, but it's also something that I've seen a lot of people get kind of nervous about over time. And so I wanted to share a bit of a definition that we've had at the studio around thinking how perhaps how privilege might work. Can everybody see the next slide? It says privilege : so then what it says is next, privilege is a gift that you did nothing to earn. Can you all see that on the slide? And I think it's helpful to think about privilege in that sense, because it's both something that is present, and the fact that perhaps you didn't earn it can make it very opaque to those who have it. But because it is this gift, there are those who never got those gifts and go, where'd you get one of those? Can I get one of those? Oh shit, I'm never going to get one of those. Damn it. But not knowing that it exists and that it's on your person doesn't mean it doesn't happen, because others can definitely see it. And I think it can show up sometimes when we are least expecting it, because privilege often is, again, like I said, it's kind of like invisible to us. I know that in the places I've worked, phrases like ask for forgiveness, not permission, lean in, move fast and break things, or go big or go home are often said with a lot of great effort, because I think it's trying to encourage an environment where people are trying to be bold and to take risks. But I think it sometimes gets lost that those phrases are steeped in privilege. What it might mean is that I can afford to take risks, and surely you can too. Sorry, that hasn't been always the case. At least it hasn't been for me. And that the people who have often given this type of advice to me don't look like me. So I think it's harmful, perhaps, to sort of judge someone's ability to be bold when this is the baseline, without remembering that their baseline is very different for everyone, especially on this call. There is a wide spectrum of affordances to privilege that can vary depending on who you are and your sort of like place in society, even from which accent you have, and then also from which country you're both born in, and also which place you're working in right now, even on this call alone. So almost like getting a handle on what are these privileges, and also in which context matters. So almost to be able to kind of like track both the context and the privileges both intersect with each other. So I'm going to share with you almost like an inventory that I had to make of like, here are all the privileges I have access to. Can folks see this list on the left-hand side? Privilege, there's a big table. So I'm actually 45 now, so this has changed. This changed about a week ago. So hello, I'm now 45. I'm male, I'm cis, heterosexual, neurotypical, able-bodied, extroverted. My childhood is mostly trauma-free, and I have a British accent. So those things pay out differently depending on the context I'm in. So this is how it helps me here. My judgment is often deferred to due to my age. Patriarchy offers me unlimited leadership roles. I'm accepted for the sex organs I was assigned at birth. Who I'm attracted to is supported and protected by law often. I'm free of any major side effects that come from medication. Environments are mostly unencumbered that I encounter with barely any unencumbered physical mobility issues. My verbal processing is often rewarded and encouraged, as in like when I speak, people listen. I spend little time coping strategies for my past trauma, and my words often carry a level of gravitas that I know when I was in England didn't carry any at all, because everyone was just British accented back then. So for this last exercise, or for this next exercise, could you maybe just quietly write down, without going into a breakout room, an inventory of your own mix of unknown privileges? And if you have time, consider in which context do they show up? We're going to do this maybe quietly for about 5 minutes, and then, or maybe let's say 3 minutes, and then we'll maybe see if folks can share. And Shisui, do you mind putting on some music again? I'm going to put this question in the chat. Would you mind turning it down just a little bit?
Sorry.
Thank you. Okay, I'll put that in the chat. I'm going to turn off the screen share. And please feel free to take yourself off camera if it will help for about 3 minutes. I'll come back up in that time. Oh, somebody said bring up the table. Yeah, let me see if I can get that back up.
It's okay, I'll do it.
Oh, thank you. Okay. Thanks so much, everyone. I think that's about 3 minutes. Let's see if we can take the screen share off. And love to hear from folks again. Either please put your chat into the chat window or take yourself off mute. But I'm curious to hear what came up for you. Please don't feel like you need to disclose anything by any stretch, but just like what came up for you in doing the exercise of doing the inventory, and especially the question around context. Is there a combination you perhaps hadn't noticed before, or does it make sense now to look back on it to see how, oh yeah, that may have shown up and I maybe didn't notice it? Curious to hear what came up for folks. No? Oh, Jenna?
When I used your privileges as a model, I got to number 2 and I was going to be like, oh, I'm female. That's a privilege. Wait, no, it's not. So then I felt very primed for, yeah, and then this and this. And then I started thinking of disadvantages. So it took me a little bit to push through just with the priming. It took me a minute to push through the disadvantages before I could see the privileges, such as, you know, living in economic stability or, you know, violence-free spaces, especially growing up. So feeling a sense of safety, both fiscally and physically. So I think those are, and as a freelancer, I have a lot of choice in what I do because of my current economic freedom. So when we talk about like choosing whom to work with, I always feel like, of course I would do that. But when people ask me about freelancing, I say, here's a caveat. I live in the USA and I don't have to worry about healthcare. And so whatever I'm doing as a freelancer might not look like what you might be having to decide for. So those are some privileges that come up.
Thank you for sharing, and thanks for pushing through the very real disadvantages that you face as a woman in general. But also, I think it's helpful to kind of take stock of some of those privileges that are also happening at the same time. It's not happening, but I also think there are people on other parts of the world or just in like one street over that will see both your womanhood and the privileges that come along with whatever you just described. So they're both happening at the same time, and I definitely think it could be quite a powerful sort of moment to kind of reconcile. Like it's all true. It's complicated. It's all true. Still sucks, but it's true. I even think that something that's not in this list is I grew up in a household where there was an expectation I was going to go to college. We never discussed not going. It was just. I wouldn't even say smokes are privileged like it's good. It's just we just never discussed the option to not. And in fact, I think I still feel a slight chip on my shoulder because I didn't get a master's because everyone else did. Or at least I think I did. Or at least I feel the weight of it. So there's like a odd set of things that come from your family of origin that I think set the mold for then how you might see the world. And I think this is why it's so helpful is that how you see the world from your perspective, Jenna, can be radically different from those who we work alongside or work through or work for. And that baseline can be thousands of miles apart without realizing it.
Your words make me think of a facilitated activity I did once, a privilege walk. And one of them was just everyone standing in a line and then moving forward or backward a step based on what was spoken by the facilitator. And one was, and the US was, did your family speak English primarily in the household as a benefit? And so there were so many moments that were privileges that were surprising and real. Thank you, George.
Sure, thanks for sharing. Anyone else want to share what was coming up for them? Again, feel free to chat. I think Jamie says, Jamie, do you mind if I read this out? It says, in a South African context, the fact that I have electricity and I'm educated came up as a privilege. Jamie, do you mind speaking a little more to this? Is Jamie still here?
Yeah, I was just sitting here thinking, like, especially based on last week's talk from Karabo, like we underestimate the fact that we have access to electricity, we have access to technology, which gives us the whole world and access to the whole world, to technology, and to learning, and that in turn gives us opportunities we couldn't dream of if we didn't have access. So that was the first thing that came to mind when I was thinking of privilege.
Thanks, Jamie. I feel like I so rarely have to think about it, but when I have lost it, like almost like when you lose the privilege, you go, "Oh yeah, actually that was really handy. I kind of needed that. I kind of rely on it all the time, and I don't even think about it." We certainly have had some intermittent power loss over here, just in my house, and the fact that I have fairly stable internet isn't to be dismissed. It is a very non-trivial phenomena. I mean, the fact that we can even do this right now, real time, is a testament to the fact that I just don't even think about not having internet. But I know that not everybody does. So therefore, when it comes to thinking about how do we make either accessible or affordable the services we're designing, you can't simply place yourself as the center and those are lived experiences, but rather who are we excluding by setting certain parameters to be known versus others that are not. And I think even Shiswei's introduction at the very beginning about trying at least nominally to accommodate people with low vision, our studio has done, is kind of going through a very sort of, I'd say, challenging time trying to understand what impact disability and access means to our studio. I think we still have very, very long way to go. But those accommodations are simply an attempt of trying to recognize, oh, wow, everybody in our studio tends to kind of fall into certain known phenomena. And we haven't really given that much time to think about how do we design affordances for people who simply are not us. And that's corroborated how we talk with each other, our families that we hang out with, our communities that we hang out with, even our clients. There's a certain level of like baseline that we have considered to be normal standard when that's not always true. So appreciate, Jamie, your reminder that those things, more like infrastructure, in addition to experience, is not always the same for everyone. Karaba? I really am not sure if I'm pronouncing your name. Please tell me if I'm not.
You are. No, you are. Actually, thanks, Jamie, for bringing that up. So last week when I gave the talk on accessibility design, actually, the point that she's touching on from a South African context is that there's about 600 million people in Africa who don't have access to electricity. Now, if you think about that, and you are sitting in suburbia and you have access to join this call, the privilege just alone is a lot. Whether you're a woman or a man, it doesn't really matter. The mere fact that you've got access to this tool that connects the world and runs businesses and all sorts of crazy things is a privilege. I remember there's another point that I raised about how we as designers don't necessarily even go as far as designing the physical spaces as user experience designers. We don't even go as far as designing the physical spaces that we are trying to move foot traffic to. We don't have a say, or we don't even push ourselves to move to that extent to say, if we're going to push people to a mall, is the mall designed in a way that people without accessibility can access it? The ATM that you design, as you enhance it to be interactive and touchscreen, can people still reach it? You know what I mean? People that are in wheelchairs, what's the point of, enhancing this crazy interface where I can withdraw money with my face, like Face ID, but I still can't access it if I'm sitting in a wheelchair? What's the point? Like, to your point, we are designing amongst ourselves, and that's a privilege also, because we choose the friends that we hang out with, right? The boss that you report to might not even have any disability or have unconscious bias around people with disability. How do you identify that as a privilege and as a form of power in terms of what you put out there? It goes back to that ethical question as well, to say you can't question, and most of us can't do it because of the bread and butter issue, where you're just putting things out because, at the end of the day, you got to pay your bills. You don't want to go back to a situation where, you're not living in the suburbs. You get relegated back to the townships where there's rampant crime, whether you're a man or woman. It's even much more crazier, to have to move back to a corrugated iron building and call that a home. So that privilege of knowing that, if something happens, you can call the cops. Not a lot of people have that privilege to even call the cops because they don't have access to phones.
Yeah. Thank you so much for those comments. I think we're going to move on. We have this one last section, which I think is a culminating set of questions that will actually leverage both privileges we talked about and our identities, because it talks about power in motion. So let's see if I can, fingers crossed that this screen share will work one last time. She's ready. Oh, thank you. Perfect. So this next set of questions are tricky. When was the last time you gave away your power intentionally? When was the last time you lost your power unintentionally? When was the last time you took someone else's power? These are all written as whens, not ifs, because it's definitely happening all the time. And if anything, part of this set of questions is about maybe even realizing, oh shit, I lost power in that meeting when someone said, what Jen meant to say was this, and some dude speaks for you. You ever seen that thing? Where someone will say exactly the same thing, but just say it with a male voice? Happens all the time. Very frustrating. Or when you put your name second in a response to a proposal and realize that just placing your name in a subordinate fashion can be read differently. I just want us to be mindful of how power moves and how it transfers in fleeting moments. And I think I want us to be mindful of when and how it's happening, if only just to be more observant of it. Shisra, I'm going to ask if you could maybe set up the breakout rooms one more time. And while we set up the break rooms, I'm going to try to chat those questions into the chat. Let's see if I can do that. Wow, Shisra does the when.
Do you want 5 or 10 minutes for this next round?
Let's do 5 minutes, but I'm going to give everybody a couple of minutes to kind of get themselves settled to think about these questions.
Okay.
So just put the questions into the chat. I think I spelled everything right. I think we have enough time to now go into breakout rooms.
Hi.
Them for this last section, but also any reflections across this last couple of hours altogether. Feel free to take yourself off mute or put your comments in the chat. Love to hear from folks who perhaps haven't spoken as yet. Thank you.
Hi, George. Can I ask a question?
Of course.
So far we spoke about giving one's power away. Is it just an ideological position of so sorry, let me rephrase this. Giving your power away versus empowering other people, is that just an ideological position, different ideological position with the same idea? Or what is your thoughts on that?
I'm not sure if I see a huge difference per se in empowerment versus handing over power, but I do want to highlight the idea that one can actually design power transfer, and that perhaps is different than simply taking a position that I am trying to be empowering to others. The idea that one can actually try to design how power will be transferred means that there has to be some deliberate decisions about how you design those interactions. So how we've designed this session, for instance, I try to limit how much I speak in order to give power and space for those who perhaps might not. And I've tried also in many cases to try to make sure that by the time we end this session, one is reminded of the power you do have access to based on your identity and your privileges, and then perhaps how power works, such that those leaving this call have more power than they started with. And when I think about design, I think about, well, how am I going to get to that outcome? I'm not worried less about the actual design of the session, but just how am I going to shift power? Because I know in a lot of sessions like this, usually the goal of this session is to concentrate further power on the speaker, on the person who was invited. And that doesn't help me. If anything, it's the opposite of what I'm trying to do. So Ranesh, I agree with you that there is a position one can intellectually take, but I do think that since we think about it in terms of design, I'm trying to work out how do I do the design of the experience and the mechanics of things like a workshop through to actual projects that have power at its as a way for me to think about, as a lens to think about how to do design work itself. Does that help, Ranesh? I can't tell if I've made it more confusing.
I think you've made it a little clearer, though I think, as with all things, it's only led to more questions. Because obviously you're quite right, designing power transfer in the products and applications is ideal, but how do you bring that across and bring that into the team is a very interesting dynamic, I guess, to cover. But
right. So in some
talk.
cases, when we think about privilege and the concentration of power typically happens, so much of what I've seen is that there's a lot of power given to white males who are neurotypical, cis, and able-bodied. Sometimes more than perhaps they should, considering how often people who are not those identities have to work 2 times, 3 times, 4 times as hard. So to be curious about where is the power in this room, and does my responsibility, now that I'm aware of my power, to shed it, to empower those in the room who don't have it, is that something I can design? So when I think about how power shows up in my design work, I'm often wondering, I've been afforded a whole number of things that I know there are darker skinned counterparts who do the same work who do not get these opportunities. That troubles me. Does that make sense, Ranesh?
Yes, it does.
So I think it's important that we are conversant in the mechanics of how power moves and shows up, because it's already happening anyway. And to be clumsy with it, I think, is irresponsible. So to be mindful, to be careful, to be good stewards of power is one of the goals of a workshop like this, because I feel like I can't ask you to be a good steward of it if you don't know it's there. And so partly to be able to see it, to make it tangible, to be able to like detect it when it's happening, to go, oh, I'm losing power, it's slipping away in my hands right now. I want you to be like conversant in it, because then you can do something, you can act upon that knowledge. That's my hope, at least. Thank you, Ranesh. I'm not sure again if I'm pronouncing your name, but so sorry. But thank you for that comment.
Good enough. If I may just ask one final question on this power transfer thing. So far, we've really talked about empowering people and a willing leader to empower other people, right? Mm-hmm. That's been the real topic of this entire talk. I don't know if you've been in the situation, but I know I have, where you've got people with power and you, for lack of a better phrase, are forcing the transfer of power from, sorry, from, as you just said today, perhaps a white-centric, male-centric environment into a more distributed environment. That tends to leave those who have that power in a bit of uncomfortable situation, right? How do you redress that so that when we do, for lack of a better phrase, stand up for the power that we as people of color, people with disabilities, as in my case, but especially, how do we, for lack of a better phrase, how do we stand up for that without almost demeaning the existing power structure?
Yeah, I don't know
makes
if
sense.
it's. No, I think it makes perfect sense. I'm not sure if it's possible without getting some feelings bent out of shape. I am not sure how fruitful it is to be designing my experience to be comfort seeking, but rather that the act of doing this power transfer has challenges that are going to be upsetting. What I'm pretty certain is that those who are powerful have so many spaces to find comfort in outside of the one that I'm designing that I think they're going to be fine. I'm not trying to be callous or to say like I don't care, but considering how few spaces that people without power through multiple identities feel powerful, to be able to design that space with some care, it takes enormous effort, but also might be one of the few times that whole week or year or month that that space was designed for them. So as a net outcome, I'm not sure if you can if I can ensure comfort and that person and those with power to be consoled. My goal is not to make them upset, but I also don't know if that's if my focus is going to make that the priority. I feel like my priority will be with others in that room and in that time. I love to hear from others. This has been so stimulating, Renisha. I feel like you and I could probably talk for hours more. Do others have things they want to share? And if not, I think I might get ready to hand back to Shisui, who's been so kind to to make space for these conversations. Shisui, any final comments before we start wrapping up?
Well, from my side, I just wanted to say thank you, because when I first found your work online and reviewed some of your videos, I thought to myself, this is a topic that it's like the elephant in the room. Nobody's talking about it, but it needs to be spoken about. And even if we just have, even though we've just touched the surface this evening, I don't know if it would be possible for you, if we could have a follow-up session in future. But I think that you brought a new perspective to the group, and I think you've brought up some difficult topics in a very helped us articulate things in a very constructive way, giving us words that we kind of never not really had before. Because I think sometimes you can't really see certain things, and sometimes you just need the vocabulary for it, if that makes any sense.
Of course, yeah. I'd be happy to perhaps do a follow-up. I think there actually is a new talk that I'm trying to practice right now around ethics in design. If folks are interested in talking about that, I feel like that is a nightmare. Our design industry is riddled with ethical compromises, and I feel like, again, it's something that we don't tend to do a lot of conversation around, and I feel like we get really unprepared for when we'll get rolled over. Oh, look, there's a couple of comments saying yes. Oh, yes, hello. Is it Mandla?
Hey, hello. Yes, it's
Hi.
Mandla. So I think that is something I'm very interested in. I actually did my master's thesis on ethical design in multi-user virtual environments. And the very surprising thing was that the supervisor that I got, who's working towards, I think he's got a PhD in like VR and like virtual environments. He actually disliked that idea so much that he tried to stop it at every point. And I think this is one of it is because like what we've been speaking about tonight, also ethics touches on that, on like the power, who has access to these things, how they affect people, and how they affect non-users. Because we kind of think of product in a vacuum. The website you're designing is not in a vacuum. The product you're designing is not in a vacuum. It has impacts on stakeholders that aren't actually using that platform. And we saw that in the American election. We've seen that with so many tools and products. And I think that is something that's really important and that we have to push towards. It's, especially if I tried to do it, I ended up doing it and getting a distinction for it. But if I had to go through so much just to do it, and my supervisor used to say it's a political thing, and I was like, it's not political. It's actually not political. It's something that's actually needed. And it was, yeah, it was quite a fight to get it done. So I think it is a really important topic, and I'd love to see you speak on that.
Maybe I should be the one presenting, actually, Wanda. You might have already a strong point of view on this one, but I would love to. So if folks will be willing to have a session, perhaps we can find time and get it on the calendar. But I've appreciated so much of these conversations that we've had so far, these comments and the questions in the chat, and as you've taken yourself off mute. Thank you so much for spending your evening, my morning with me. It's been wonderful to be able to see folks, and I think there's folks from all over the world here, so it's been super cool. Please let me know if there's anything more I can do to help. You can always just reach out to me. It's just george@greatergoodstudio.com, and like I'm around. So let me know how I can help. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Night, everybody.
Bye.
That's everybody. Thanks so much, George.